In 1883, a team of professional archaeologists dispatched by the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology arrived in the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia. They were led by a man named Professor Norris, and their mission was to excavate a series of 50 ancient burial mounds. What they found inside one of those mounds was documented in the Smithsonian's own publication, the 12th Annual Report of the Bureau of Ethnology. The language is clinical, measured, bureaucratic. The kind of language institutions use when they want to record something without drawing attention to it. The report describes a vault inside the mound containing a skeleton of unusually large size. The skeleton was measured in situ, 7 feet 6 inches in length, 19 inches between the shoulder sockets. Surrounding the central figure, arranged in a deliberate ritual formation, were 10 additional skeletons. The find was documented. The remains were catalogued. The report was filed. And then, as far as the public record is concerned, the skeleton of the 7'6" individual from the Kanawha Valley ceased to exist. It was not the first. It was not the last. And it was not the strangest. The deeper I went into the Smithsonian's own records, the more I found entries like this. Entries that describe skeletal remains of extraordinary size, excavated from burial mounds across the eastern United States, measured by professionals, documented in official reports, shipped to Washington, and then never heard about again. Not one, not a handful, hundreds. And the question that nobody at the Smithsonian has ever adequately answered is not whether the skeletons existed. Their own reports say they did. The question is where they went. Start with the reports, because the reports are the foundation, and the foundation is the Smithsonian's own documentation. The Bureau of Ethnology was established in 1879 under the direction of John Wesley Powell. Its mandate was to study the indigenous peoples of North America, and a central focus of its early work was the excavation of the thousands of burial mounds that dotted the landscape of the eastern United States, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, from the Appalachians to the Mississippi. Between 1881 and 1890, the Bureau's Division of Mound Exploration, led by Cyrus Thomas, excavated over 2,000 mounds across the country. The annual reports of the Bureau are publicly available. They sit in libraries. They have been digitized. Anyone can read them. And scattered throughout those reports, in the same clinical, bureaucratic language used to describe pottery sherds and soil stratification, are descriptions of human skeletal remains that exceed 7 feet in length. Not in one report. In multiple reports. Not from one site. From dozens. Go read them yourself. The 12th Annual Report describes not just the Kanawha Valley find, but multiple instances of skeletons measured between 7 and 8 feet from sites across West Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and Illinois. The language is always careful. Near the original surface, lying at full length upon its back, was one of the largest skeletons discovered by the Bureau agents. The length is proved by actual measurement being between 7 and 8 feet. Another entry describes a vault 8 feet long and 3 feet wide, containing a skeleton fully 7 feet long. This raises a simple but critical question. If the Smithsonian's own agents measured these skeletons in the field, documented them in official publications, and shipped the remains to Washington, where are they now? The silence was deafening. Because here's what happens when you try to trace the remains. The newspaper accounts from the era, more than 1,000 of them from towns and counties across the eastern United States, consistently end the same way. The remains were carefully packed and shipped to the Smithsonian Institution. All relics were forwarded to Washington for further study. The skeleton was sent to the National Museum. The formula repeats across decades of local reporting. A discovery is made. The remains are measured. The Smithsonian is notified. The bones are shipped. And after the shipment, the record goes silent. not quiet, silent. The skeleton that was 7 feet 6 inches in the Kanawha Valley does not appear in any publicly accessible catalog of the Smithsonian's Physical Anthropology collection. The remains described in the 12th annual report as one of the largest skeletons discovered by the Bureau agents cannot be located in the institution's current holdings. The bones that were carefully packed and sent from dozens of sites across the country, documented in the Smithsonian's own annual reports, appear to have entered the institution and then vanished from the record. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Now, here's where I need you to see the scale of what happened. Because the oversized skeletons are not an isolated mystery. They are one thread in a much larger pattern of institutional collection that is, by any measure, staggering. Between the 1860s and the 1990s, the Smithsonian and other American institutions collected the skeletal remains of hundreds of thousands of indigenous human beings. Not hundreds, not thousands, hundreds of thousands. When the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed in 1990, requiring federally funded institutions to return indigenous remains and cultural objects to their descendant communities, the Smithsonian alone held the remains of approximately 18,000 individuals. Other institutions held tens of thousands more. The total number of indigenous remains held in American institutional collections at the time of NAGPRA's passage has been estimated at between 100,000 and 600,000 individuals. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The same institution that documented oversized skeletal remains in its own annual reports, that received shipments of bones from across the country, that built one of the largest collections of human remains in the world, has been unable to account for specific finds that its own agents measured and cataloged in the field. The evidence suggests something much larger than misplaced bones. Because here's the context that nobody puts together. The Bureau of Ethnology was not just excavating mounds, it was fighting a war of narrative. In the 19th century, a powerful and widespread belief held that the burial mounds of eastern North America had not been built by the ancestors of living Native Americans. They had been built by a lost race, a separate, more advanced civilization that had existed before the indigenous peoples and had been destroyed or displaced by them. This belief, known as the mound builder myth, served a specific political function. If the mounds were not built by indigenous peoples, then indigenous peoples had no deep claim to the land. They were latecomers, interlopers, and their removal to make way for European settlement was not displacement, but a restoration of the natural order. The Bureau of Ethnology under Powell and Thomas was tasked with demolishing this myth, and they succeeded. Cyrus Thomas's landmark 1894 report conclusively demonstrated that the mounds were built by the ancestors of living indigenous peoples. The mound builder myth was debunked. The racial fantasy of a lost white civilization was discredited. This was good science. This was important work. This was the correction of a racist narrative that had been used to justify the dispossession of indigenous peoples for decades. But here's where the thread gets uncomfortable. In the process of establishing that the mounds were built by indigenous peoples, the Bureau had a vested institutional interest in minimizing anything that didn't fit the narrative they were correcting. Reports of oversized skeletal remains complicated the story. They provided ammunition for the very myth the Bureau was trying to destroy. If the mound builders included individuals of extraordinary size, that detail could be used and was being used by proponents of the lost race theory to argue that the builders were a different, larger, more powerful people who had been supplanted by the current indigenous population. This raises a simple but critical question. Did the institutional need to debunk one myth create the conditions for burying another set of evidence? I want to pause here and ask something that isn't usually asked. What did the indigenous peoples themselves say about the bones? Because they weren't silent. They were never silent. Across dozens of tribal oral traditions, from the Paiute to the Delaware to the Choctaw to the Sioux, there are accounts of earlier peoples who were larger than the current inhabitants. The Paiute tradition describes the Sitka, a race of red-haired people of great stature who were enemies of the Paiute. The Delaware oral history, recorded in the Wallamolam, describes encounters with powerful, large-bodied peoples during their migration across the continent. The Choctaw tradition describes a race of giants called Nahulo, who inhabited the land before them. These oral traditions were collected, documented, and filed by the same Bureau of Ethnology that was excavating the mounds. The Bureau recorded the stories. It acknowledged them as part of the indigenous oral record, and then it set them aside. Because in the framework the Bureau was constructing, a framework designed to prove that the mound builders were the ancestors of living indigenous peoples and nobody else, stories about earlier, larger peoples were inconvenient. Not wrong. Inconvenient. The deeper I went, the more I found that the institutional treatment of the oversized skeletal remains followed a specific pattern: discovery, documentation, shipment, silence. The pattern doesn't vary, it doesn't break. It is as consistent as a policy, as uniform as a procedure, as reliable as an instruction transmitted through institutional culture, rather than written on any single document. Now let's talk about what was actually found, because separating the real from the exaggerated is essential, and the real is strange enough. The Adena culture, a pre-Columbian civilization that flourished in the Ohio Valley from roughly 1000 BC to 200 BC, is archaeologically documented as having individuals of unusual stature. Physical anthropological analysis of Adena skeletal remains has consistently identified individuals well above the average height of their contemporaries. The Adena people built some of the most impressive mounds in eastern North America, including the Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, which stands nearly 70 feet tall and was one of the largest conical mounds on the continent. The 7-foot range is where the documented evidence is strongest. The Smithsonian's own annual reports describe multiple individuals in this range, measured by trained professionals in controlled excavation conditions. 7 feet is not mythological. It is not impossible. It is unusual, significantly above the average for any population in any era. But it is within the extreme range of human variation. What makes it significant is not the height alone, but the frequency, the number of reports, the consistency across sites separated by hundreds of miles, and the fact that these individuals were buried with elaborate grave goods in central positions within the mounds, surrounded by attendant burials, suggesting that their unusual size was recognized and revered by their communities. The newspaper reports, which go beyond 7 feet into the 8, 9, and even higher range, are a different category of evidence. 19th-century newspapers were not peer-reviewed journals. They were commercial enterprises that competed for readers with sensational stories. Some reports are clearly exaggerated. Some are likely fabricated. Some may involve the misidentification of megafaunal remains. But the volume of reports, more than 1,000 from across the country, and their consistency in describing specific anatomical features, double rows of teeth, pronounced brow ridges, massive jawbones that reportedly fit over a modern human face, creates a body of testimony that is difficult to dismiss entirely as fiction. The official explanation collapses here, because we're told that the reports are all hoaxes, all exaggerations, all the product of 19th-century sensationalism, and some of them undoubtedly are. But the Smithsonian's own annual reports are not newspapers. They are institutional publications written by professional archaeologists describing measurements taken in the field. And the remains described in those reports, the 7'6" skeleton from the Kanawha Valley, the skeletons measured between 7 and 8 feet from multiple sites. These are the Smithsonian's own data. And the Smithsonian cannot produce the remains. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every institution that collected remains during this period. Discoveries are made. Remains are shipped. Records go silent. And when researchers attempt to trace the specific finds described in 19th-century reports, they encounter what the Smithsonian describes as gaps in the collection record. Not conspiracies. Gaps. Administrative gaps. Cataloging gaps. The kind of gaps that an institution with 18,000 indigenous skeletons in its basement might develop over a century of collection, accessioning, reorganization, and storage. But the gaps always cluster around the same category of find. The ordinary remains are traceable. The pottery is traceable. The grave goods are traceable. The oversized skeletal remains, the ones that were described as the most significant discoveries made by Bureau agents, the ones that warranted detailed description in the annual reports, those are the ones that disappear. I don't have a complete theory. I have a question that multiplies the deeper I look. Why does the Smithsonian's own documentation describe skeletal remains of extraordinary size excavated from burial mounds across the eastern United States? Why were those remains shipped to Washington and then never publicly displayed, never studied in published research, never made available to independent investigators? Why do the indigenous oral traditions of dozens of tribes describe earlier peoples of unusual stature? And why were those traditions collected and filed and never integrated into the institutional narrative? Why does every trail that begins with a documented find and a shipment to Washington end in the same silence, and the question underneath all the others? The one that sits in the storage facilities of the Smithsonian, in the uncatalogued collections, in the gaps that the institution acknowledges but does not explain. What is in there? Not the 18,000 remains that have been partially catalogued and that NAGPRA has begun the process of returning to descendant communities. The other ones. The ones that were measured in the field at 7 feet 6 inches and 19 inches across the shoulders and shipped to Washington in carefully packed crates and never heard about again. I'll leave you with this. The Smithsonian Institution has 85,000 square feet of storage space in its Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland. It holds over 154 million objects, specimens, and artifacts. Its physical anthropology collection is one of the largest in the world. And somewhere in that collection, or in the gaps where that collection fails to account for what its own agents documented in the field, there are bones that were measured by professionals, described in official publications, and then removed from the public record. The bones didn't disappear because they weren't real. The Smithsonian's own reports say they were real. They didn't disappear because they weren't significant. The reports describe them as among the most important discoveries made by Bureau agents. They disappeared because, once inside the institution, they entered a system of storage and classification that has never been independently audited for completeness, that has never been required to account for every item described in its own field reports, and that has never explained why the most unusual finds from the most important excavation program in American archaeology cannot be located. The mounds are still there, the reports are still there, the bones were shipped, the trail ends at a loading dock in Washington. Ask yourself what's on the other side of that door.